Hello, this is Victoria from the larder, back with Kids in the Kitchen, and today we're going to make a delicious apple pie. First of all, before we start cooking, we always make sure we've thoroughly washed our hands, tied back long hair if we need to, and if you've got a pinny, pop it on. I'm going to take you through the ingredients for the apple pie and the equipment. So we have different components. We've got the filling for the apple pie. So here we have 3 medium cooking apples. You could, if you had them, use 2 large ones. We've got cinnamon and caster sugar and a little bit of water. Then for the pastry, we've got plain flour, butter, which we've diced into these little cubes, that's cold from the fridge, cold water and salt, that's about a pinch of salt. And the final set of ingredients are to glaze the pie so that the pastry looks lovely when you serve it, and we use an egg, a little bit of milk and some sugar. The equipment we need to make our apple pie, to start with, we've got a chopping board, a peeler, quite a sharp knife, be careful with that, a spoon to stir the mixture, and a pan to prepare the mixture on the top of the stove. And then when we're making the pastry, we need a mixing bowl and a rolling pin, a pastry brush for when we get to that stage of glazing the pastry, and then just to help with the pastry I've put a spoon, a fork and a knife. We're going to make the pie in this, it's actually a cake tin, but you might have a glass or a china pie dish about that size. And also we've got a baking tray which is going to go in the oven and get hot before we put the pie in. I'll show you how to make the pastry first. We're doing that first because it's going to have a little rest in the fridge before we actually use it. So we start with the flour, which is 150 grams of plain flour, into the mixing bowl. And then we add the cubes of butter into the mixing bowl. And this is where you need your lovely clean hands, because we're going to get our hands in there and we're going to rub the flour and the butter together, rubbing the butter into the flour with your fingertips, lifting it so it drops back into the bowl. And we keep doing that, going all through the butter and the flour, squishing them together until eventually we get what's called a fine crumb. The butter and the flour rubbed in together to make quite a nice crumb. I'm just going to add a pinch of salt to that to bring out the flavour of the flour. Doesn't need to be too much. And then I add the water. Now this I do carefully because you don't want it to be too dry, but even worse, you don't want it to be too wet. So I'm thinking I'm going to put about 5 spoons of water into that and then see how it looks. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'm going to use a fork and just get that mixed around a bit. It should start coming together. And use the fork to push it together like that. And then I'm going to use my hands because they're the best way to get it into one. In fact, 5 spoons might have been a little bit too much water. I would suggest you try 4 spoons to start with. That is a little bit wet. Never mind. We've got spare flour. We'll can just very cautiously sprinkle a little bit of that onto it so it's not quite so sticky. Ooh. And that's just one of the things about making pastry is getting the amount of water right. Though that doesn't feel so bad, and that's quite soft. I'm not going to squish it around with my hands too much. I'm actually going to get a small piece of cling film. Here we go, and I'm going to wrap it in the cling film to stop it drying out. And I'm going to pop it in the fridge where it can stay cool, because one of the tricks with good pastry is to try and keep it as cool as possible while you're working with it. Okay, that can go in the fridge. So now we're going to prepare the apples for the fillings. I'm going to peel them, and then I'll show you how to cut them up before they go in the pan. Now we're putting apples in our pie, which are always delicious. When you've got apple in pie, you can also put some raisins or sultanas in there as well. They taste delicious with apple. You could put a different sort of filling in your pie. In fact, the pastry we've made today can be used for savoury pies as well. So you could make butter pie or cheese and onion pie in there. Right, nearly there with my 3 apples. There are other fruits you could put into a pie, although they might be a bit tricky to get hold of at the moment. You could even perhaps find something in a tin, I don't know. I'm not sure that would be very good. Right. What about rhubarb? Rhubarb, when it's in season, is good. That can go in a pie. Right, now I'm going to show you how to cut the apples safely, minding your fingers. So we sit it on the board, get the knife. It's quite a sharp one that you need, so you might need an adult to do this. And then with your fingers tucked safely out of the way, we're going to cut that side. This is so that we can get the core out of the apple. And that side. And that side. Oops, my fingers. There we go, that's the apple core. We don't want that, that can go with the peel. And then we're just going to quite finely chop the apple up and pop it into the pan. We're going to cook the apple filling on the top of the stove in our pan. I've put the sliced and diced apple into the pan, and it's just starting to get warm. I'm going to add to that 3 tablespoons of caster sugar, half a teaspoon of cinnamon, which is a most delicious spice and goes with apple really, really well. And then about 2 tablespoons of water, which will just stop it sticking to the pan. And then we have to stir that gently. So I'm starting this on quite a high heat, and I'm keeping it gently moving because it can because of all the sugar in the apple and the sugar that we've added, it can very easily stick to the pan. And then once it's hot through, I shall turn it down to a much lower heat until it's ready. Apple filling has softened nicely in the pan over a very gentle heat, stirring it quite often to make sure it doesn't stick. And I'm going to pop that into a bowl. I just washed out the pastry bowl, and I'm going to let that cool down for a little bit before we put it into the pie. Right, the next job is to get the oven hot, and we put a baking tray in to get hot as well, because this helps with cooking the bottom part of the pastry in the pie. So I'm going to put the oven on to 180 with this because it's a fan oven, 200 if it's not a fan oven, and then baking tray goes onto the shelf like that. Right, now I'm going to just lightly grease the inside of the pie dish or cake tin that I'm using. I've got some of the spare butter and just a bit of the butter wrapping, and pop some butter onto it like that. and just rub it round. Oops. I'm using the inside of the butter wrapping, not the outside. There we are, that's just got a very light coat of butter on it. That can go in the bin, that can go back in the fridge. And then that's ready to put the pastry in. And now I'm going to roll out the pastry. So unwrapping it, it's been in the fridge about 20 minutes, which was how long it took to peel and chop the apples and then make the filling. So now we've got nice cool pastry, lovely clean work surface, a sprinkling of the flour so that the pastry doesn't stick to the work surface while you're rolling it. There we go, and a little bit on the rolling pin so the pastry doesn't stick to the rolling pin as well. If you haven't got a rolling pin, there's all sorts of other things you can use. A bottle, a glass bottle, even a roll of cling film can be used to press and roll the pastry. I'm going to cut the pastry into 2 pieces now. I'm going to make one piece about 2/3 of the pastry, so a bigger piece and a smaller piece. The bigger piece is going to line the bottom of the tin. So we're going to start rolling that out. I'm just going to make sure it's got a little bit of flour on all its surfaces so it doesn't stick. And then very gently with the rolling pin, press and roll forwards and backwards. Not too hard, but just enough to keep it getting bigger. Turn the other way because we want it to roughly fit a circle to go in that dish. Just gonna just flip it, make sure it's not sticking. Ooh. Flip it over. Next step is to transfer the pastry into the dish. So I'm just going to very gently ease it off the work surface onto the rolling pin, hoping it's not sticking. And that's not too bad. Bring the dish over, pop it in over the dish very gently, and then carefully, making sure not to get holes in it, press it with my thumbs as carefully as I can into the dish. Now, my pastry wasn't a perfect circle, obviously, so I've got some bits where there's a bit too much and some bits where there's not enough. I'm going to get myself a knife and just carefully trim off the bits that are too big. I'm using a very clever trick with a bit of water, stick them where we need them. Okay, I'm just trimming the pastry off the edges like this carefully, and then it's a very clever trick. You just add a bit of water where you want the 2 pieces of pastry to stick together. See, nothing perfect about this pie, but I can assure you it's going to be tasty when it's cooked. We don't want... Right, I'm going to make sure there's enough flour on the work surface again, because I'm going to roll out the lid for the pie now with my second piece of pastry. Just make sure it's got a little bit of flour on all the surfaces. Get that rolling pin again with flour. And I'm going to try and make a circle this time if I can. It would be nice if it fitted at the top. I think one of the tricks to this is not to have your pie dish too big. Of course, if your pie dish isn't a circle, that doesn't matter. You can do it with a rectangle or a square pie dish, whatever shape you've got, an oval one. Just turn that over, put a bit more flour on there. You don't want too much flour, but just enough to keep it from sticking. So the apple filling has cooled down a little bit, and we can pop that into the pie now. There we go. And I'll just spread that out a little bit so it's evenly spread out over the base of the pie dish. I can smell that cinnamon, it's delicious. And then we're ready to put the top on the pie. So again, using the rolling pin and gently easing the pastry off the work surface, we lift it over to the pie dish and carefully pop it over. And then we need, I would say, a little bit of water on your fingertips to go around here. Perhaps could have done that before I lifted the lid over. And then those two bits, the top and the bottom, should be able to just stick together. It's not an exact science, and I suspect some of you will make pies that look a lot more professional than this one does. And we're looking forward to seeing the photos of them when you've done it. I'm just going to crimp the edges of the pie together, the pastry, with my fingers so that we know it's going to stick together. And then in a moment I'm going to show you how to make the egg wash to go over the top, which will make a lovely shiny pie crust when it cooks. Right. That bit needs to stick together a little bit more. There we go. It's a little bit rough and ready, but it'll still taste good. And oh, cut a hole in the middle to let the steam out. There we go. Right, the egg wash, it's quite simple. You take the egg, break it into the bowl, beat it. Fork would be helpful, I've got a knife. Don't do this at home. There we are. Beat an egg. Splash of milk, that's all you need. I'll use the pastry brush to just mix that together. And then the pastry brush or a spatula or your fingers, if you haven't got either of those, you'll just coat the pastry. Right, we've got the egg wash over the pastry, and I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of caster sugar on the top, which will be the finishing touch. Try and get it evenly spread over the pastry. Ooh, that looks nice. And then it goes into the oven for about half an hour. But you might want to check on it after 20 minutes. I've got some oven gloves or cloths, dry cloths here for when I'm doing the hot oven. So now our apple pie has had 30 minutes in the oven and it's looking ready to come out. It's a lovely golden brown colour. I'm going to put that down over here. I'm using some dry clean cloths. But if you've got oven gloves, those are good. I'm going to remember to turn the oven off. So let that cool down a bit before you try and do anything with it. And there's one delicious apple and cinnamon pie.